Everyone, my name is Dr. Jennifer Fane, and I'm really excited to be part of the ECV 2020 virtual conference and engage you in some of my research and some of my work, and also engage with many other people's work. So thank you for listening to my presentation. I'd love to connect with people on Twitter, or please feel free to send me an email if you have any questions about anything that I present here in my presentation. So just to frame this larger study, this study was my dissertation, so my PhD work. And the research question that I embarked on was, how can we include children's voices and children's own understandings of well-being in current conceptualizations and assessment of child well-being? It's a big lengthy question to essentially say that there are over 87 current well-being, health and well-being assessment measures, instruments for young children's well-being. And not a single one of them was informed by children. So young children had no input into any of the instruments or measures that are used to measure their well-being, which of course is used then to develop resources, to fund programs, make all sorts of hopefully helpful changes to structures and societies and processes to support child well-being. But we didn't actually know how young children conceptualize well-being and if these measures were useful. So that is essentially what my PhD study had intended to do. And then building on that, so that was aim sort of 1 and 2, and building on that, explore how young children understand and experience well-being across the transition to school. So moving from early childhood education and care spaces into the first year of formal schooling. So in terms of the methodology, I used a citizen-child theoretical approach, which comes from Morrow 2002. A child-citizen approach essentially recognizes children's rights and capacities to contribute to knowledge. So that stems from both the UNCRC and more importantly, this idea that only young children can be experts in their own lives. By the time anyone becomes an older child or a youth or an adult, we've already forgotten what it is like to be a young child, and we draw on conceptual frameworks or conceptual tools that are different than young children do. So therefore, if we want to understand child well-being, we need to ask young children about their well-being. Of course, we need to do this carefully and cautiously, because you certainly don't go to a 3-year-old and say, tell me about your well-being. But we can do really amazing participatory research with young children when we are careful and cautious about the method, or at least that's what I would like to talk to you about today. So this larger study was in 2 stages. So the first was stage 1, which involved 78 3- to 5-year-old children attending 8 early childhood education and care services in metropolitan Adelaide, South Australia. So the 8 services were quite diverse in terms of geographical location, as well as the socioeconomic status of the neighborhood. And all children from all 8 services were asked to participate. And the 78 children were children who had parental consent to participate and assented to participate on the day of the research activities. Stage 2, which is and there's a circle around it because this is the stage I'm going to focus in this presentation, involved 20 children who were attending those same 8 early childhood education and care services, who were going from their final term of preschool or daycare, long daycare, into their first year of school, which is called reception in South Australia, also known as preparatory in Victoria, or kindergarten in other places in Australia and in Canada. So these 20 children, as they moved from their early childhood education care context into their first year of school, were the participants are the participants in their experiences that I will draw on in this study. So in terms of the method, I developed a visual participatory research method using emoji as a way of engaging children in telling myself, the researcher, and communicating to others their experiences and understandings without me as the researcher needing to use any words or develop questions. So it's a way of children bringing forward what they felt was important rather than me leading discussion or questions. If you want to know more about emoji as a visual participatory research method, I have published a paper on that. That's that Fane et al. 2018 that explains that more in detail. And stage 1 really focused on understanding how young children experienced well-being in relation to adult-derived frameworks. And that is the next slide I'll get into in a minute. Stage 2, which is the focus of this presentation, used the child-identified indicators of well-being from the first stage to explore how children's well-being changed or didn't change, or how their understandings of well-being differed from early childhood education and care context to their first year of school. And I used a qualitative longitudinal study design for that. So this is just a snapshot of the key findings from stage 1. But essentially, you can see here that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, these first 6 here are adult-derived dimensions of child well-being. So from a series of frameworks, and this is published in Fane et al. 2020, if you'd like to know more about it. The 6 adult-derived frameworks that I draw on highlight these 6 elements as key indicators of child well-being. So using the emoji method and gathering children's experiences and understandings of well-being, I ascertained that children do agree or also identified these 6 dimensions of well-being. But as importantly, these 2 on the end, its opportunities for play and feelings of agency and control, were 2 key aspects of well-being that children identified that are missing from adult-derived frameworks. Now, I would assume this is an early childhood conference. Many of us have extensive experience working with children, young children. And to think play, play is kind of you might have heard of it, it's kind of a big deal, right? We know play in early childhood is an essential part of children's day-to-day experiences, children's joy, children's development, however we want to look at it. Play is clearly wrapped up in children's lives. However, it's missing. It's not something that's considered currently in relation to, or until this study, in relation to child well-being from the social indicator framework, which is how most child well-being research is structured. So this idea that play is important really clearly came through in children's voices, and has parallels to adult-derived well-being frameworks around leisure. So it is actually quite surprising that it is missing even from a social indicators perspective. The second one is really about agency, and why children's agency is frequently not part of adult-derived child well-being frameworks is because there's this sort of ideas that, well, children don't have absolute agency. They can't just do whatever they want at any time. Therefore, agency isn't important. But that being said, I mean, adults don't really have full agency, right? Adults are constrained in a variety of ways, and children also do have agency, even though it is constrained and enabled through hierarchical relationships with adults. So even though it's not an absolute, a black and white, children certainly identified that it was important to them. And that's why these 2 indicators, these child identified indicators, form the basis of the stage 2 study. So with the stage 2 study, as I said here, it was a focus on play and agency. So we used the emoji method again with children, focusing on emojis that engage children thinking about feelings or how they might feel. So that's the first 5. Emojis of objects and items that children might find at school or home, both natural and purpose-made. And then the last set of emoji here are around the concept of rules. As young children, 4 and 5-year-olds, are not going to understand the concept of agency, I use the idea of rules as a way of getting them thinking about those hierarchical boundaries or those constraining elements that might impact on their agency. So the wording and the pictures around rules was used as a way of engaging 4 and 5-year-old children in talking about their agency or relative agency in relation to the context in which they lived, or in which they live. So for the phase 2 analysis, the data came from 2 transcripts and 2 sets of field notes. So one from children's last term in their early childhood education and care service, which were long day cares and early years spaces. And the second was from once they were in their first year of school. The first phase, when they were in their EC context, I did the research data collection with them at their ECEC service. When I caught up with child participants again, once they had transitioned to school, I completed the research process in a variety of locations at the parent or child's request. Generally, it was at their home, at the child's home, or at a local library. And that was just due to essentially due to challenges of connecting with children. The children from the 8 centers, there's 20 children from 8 centers that ended up in 16 different primary schools. So it was easiest to connect with them outside of the school structure. So for the analysis, I used, I used the structured approach to trajectory analysis developed by Grossheim and Lipstein. And these are the 4 steps here if you are interested in reading more about it. Essentially, what the key findings were in the data in relation to agency is that children's accounts of rules and who was information. So the key findings were around sort of children's accounts of rules and who should make them, and how that changed between pre and post the transition to school. And that was fascinating. This is a short presentation though, so I had to really focus. So what I am going to focus on in this presentation instead is the second piece of agency, which was children's agency within a participatory research design. Now I do have a little asterisk here because I do want to denote that participatory action research, PAR, is really a clearly defined process that is often found in public health research. Because of the age of children, this was not a full participatory research design in relation to those standards or expectations around PAR from a public health background. Instead, I drew on what is known as a pockets of participation approach, which is advocated by Frank for conducting participatory research with young children. So they had high levels of agency in multiple aspects of the process, including corroboration of creation of knowledge, corroboration of the data, presentation of the data, but they didn't participate in the design of the study and in action from the study as well. So, and there's an interesting body of literature about whether participatory research can actually truly be participatory for anyone given the structures of research and how that often happens. But with young children, that pockets of participation sort of captures this idea that they are highly engaged. It is a co-construction of knowledge, but it is still not fully participatory in the fact that equal efforts in every aspect of the research process. So in phase 1 of the stage 2 study, I worked with children in pairs at their ECEC service using emoji. And at this during this phase, most children participated in the research process in relatively expected ways. And when I say relatively expected, that was also in relation into stage 1 of the data when I was working in focus groups with the 78 children from that stage. So in phase 1 of the stage of the longitudinal study, children were generally willing and engaged participants in the research process, and they frequently interacted with each other. They co-constructed stories. They would engage or mimic or extend what their partner was doing. They moved around the space. They asked me questions. They engaged me in their thinking and in their develop and in their emoji work. And they were certainly, for the most part, willing and engaged participants. However, there were some notable exceptions. One child of the 20 asked to finish and lead the activity quite early on, which we did. The child stopped giving their assent. And 2 children chose to subvert the research. should say chose, it says choose. 2 children chose to subvert the research process in sustained ways through strategies such as avoiding, ignoring questions, or purposely giving answers that they thought were funny and silly. And this really fits really interesting into Bakhtin's theory of the carnivalesque and all types of interesting things. I could do an entire presentation just on that one piece, but I've again focused on the task at hand here. But you can see in this interaction between myself and Colton and Anderson that they're really not interested in responding to my questions in the way that they perceive that I would want, or in a regular, or in the sorts of interactions that are adult sanctioned. Instead, we can see them going blah blah blah, da da da, and using words such as naughty boy and dirty girl and poo head. So again, anyone who's worked with young children will know the pleasure that children exhibit in engaging that sort of engaging in the absurd and the grotesque, and how that resonates with children and between children in ways that it doesn't with adults. So you can see that some children certainly did enact agency in different ways. Instead of that sort of active participation, it was active resistance. Now in phase 2, the stage 2 study, so that's once children had transitioned to primary school, children did their children's participation did look quite different, and they took on more active roles in making decisions about how they wanted to participate in the study. So for example, Carter, who when given the choice by his mother about doing the research activity at his house or at his previous early childhood education care service, he decided that he wanted to show me his favorite park, and we did the emoji activity on a park bench or on a picnic table, which was challenging because it was a windy day, but it was just a really, it was really important to him that we did it in that space, and it really allowed a really beautiful conversations and thinking and engagement from Carter by working in a space in which he chose. Abigail demonstrated agency slightly differently by deciding what was important to inform me about her school experience. So she decided to wear her school uniform, even though it was a Saturday, because that was a very important piece of talking about school to her. There were also several children who decided to bring out school books during the research activity, not because I asked, that was just something they really wanted to show me. They wanted to show me their reading logs, their Jolly Phonics work, and other children who brought out toys or games that were important to them, or even favorite books. Captain Underpants made an appearance in one, and a lot of the responses and further engagement from that child connected very clearly through to Captain Underpants, particularly around the concept of pee-pee sandwiches. That was a very big piece of that child's participation. So some of the notable differences between phase 1, so last term of early childhood and care context, and the first term of formal schooling, was that, oh, do I have two? I forgot to switch the slides. However, in phase 2, there still were children, there were children resisting the research process, but actually in more varied ways. So here we can see Ned was not uninterested in engaging with me, and engaged with me quite actively throughout the entire research activity. But he definitely did decide when he wasn't really that interested in answering a specific question, or if he felt it wasn't really a good use of his time. So here he said, yeah, no, there's more rules at school, but I'm not telling you all of them. It will just take too long. And he just decided there that there were better ways to spend our time together than answer this very long and boring question. And have Anderson here again, who in the phase 2, he assented to participate in the research activity, but it became very quickly evident that Anderson's participation was going to be continued active resistance. And you can see through this conversation here where his responses were either very challenging to hear, involved throwing or turning over the emoji, using words that didn't seem to be clearly connected to the emoji, such as volcanoes and bumping, and manipulating the emoji in ways that made it difficult for me to engage with him. And while he did assent to the research project, and this was how the way he chose to participate, I think it's also important to acknowledge that his parents brought him from school to his old long daycare center to do this. So how much agency he had within that assenting process certainly came through, even though with that assent he chose to participate in a very specific way that was resistant to the activity. So here we can see that that in that resistance we might have to rethink that concept of assent. And I did end this research activity quite soon after this interaction, because it was very clear to me from Anderson's body language as well that this was not something he was enjoying. So when I think back to the ways in which children's participation in this participatory research process, or a process in which I strive to make as participatory as possible, which is challenging due to the hierarchical relationships between adults and children, researcher and participant. But young children certainly were capable co-constructors of knowledge, and they chose to participate in the research process in a variety of ways, which is a hallmark of participatory research. Children's resistance, subversion, and modification to the research process demonstrated that they experienced high levels of agency and that they felt imbued with agency in their interactions with me. They certainly did not just do what I asked them to do because I was an adult. The ways they engaged with each other and with myself and the environment certainly indicated that they were participating in the ways in which they felt like participating frequently, while still framed in the fact that we were in educational and care contexts, and children are used to following adult direction or engaging with adults in those spaces. And the other key point was that children's further enactments of agency in phase 2 might have been from a confluence of factors. They were older, so they were about 5 to 6 months older during the second research activity. They had started school, which is often sort of a mark of sort of more autonomous, being more autonomous within an education space. They were more familiar with myself and the research process, because that process was replicated between the phase 1 and phase 2, with just some additional comparative questions in phase 2. So it might have been 1 or 2 or all of these, but it's certainly things to think about, because that jump from early childhood education and care spaces to 6 months later during starting school is a really significant event in children's lives, and likely impacts their participation in a qualitative longitudinal study. So the key points that I'm hoping you might that might resonate with you, or that you might take away from this, or that you might question and want to engage further with, is just that how thinking about children's enactments of agency informs our work as researchers, practitioners, educators, when we are conducting research with rather than on young children. And it's important, of course, to reflect on children's enactment of agency, but also being aware and thinking of them within the research process, and how you as an adult researcher interact with children during the research process was for me a really key challenge that I certainly struggled with, and I certainly can't say that I did it perfectly, but that the iterative nature of this research process and me going back and engaging with the same children certainly supported me in thinking how I carefully balance my responses or respond less, so that children's agency is not as constrained. And the final piece is that when we look at well-being metrics or instruments used with young children, such as the EDI or the AEDC, that tool was founded on the concept that young children were not capable of informing, of participating in measuring themselves. They were not able to participate in the development of that tool. So it was decided that teachers should speak for them, educators should speak for them. So, and again, with that large scale, like population-based assessment, quantitative measure, no, of course, pre-literate young children would not be capable in completing that instrument. But I really like to argue that young children certainly can inform the creation of instruments, matrices, tools that we are using to support children, and that their voices need to come through in the development of those tools and instruments and processes. So a key conclusion that I draw is that if a researcher is suggesting that young children are incapable of participating in participatory research, that the issue likely lies with the process, the methods, or the theoretical grounding of the study, not young children themselves. So these are the references from the slides. So I'll just leave this up here for a minute, but please don't hesitate to follow up if I can provide the slide deck for you. And most, I just really want to thank you for engaging in my research with me, and I welcome any further conversations. And I look forward to the conference. Thanks, everyone.